Hello everyone, I'm Professor Paul Carrier of the Western Michigan University Thomas M. Cooley Law School. I'd like to provide some helpful information relative to the materials that are assigned for Class 5 of Contracts 1. And as you may have recognized, we are moving into one of the different boxes or categories of contract formation. And so let me back up a little bit to remind where we were so we know where we are. We are in contract formation, and we talked about four primary components. The offer, we covered in week 1 with its elements, and also some examples of what look like offers and certain categories that typically are not offers, if you recall, for example, social contracts. The following week we covered the second component, which is acceptance. It also has its own elements. And one thing to keep in mind with regard to acceptance and its elements, the third element of responsiveness, don't forget that at common law, and even today, the mirror image rule may still be alive. Mind you, it's disfavored, but it might still be out there, and so you cannot fully reject it. Stay responsive, but understand that the mirror image rule could apply under appropriate circumstances. Week 3, we were still in the box or area or component of acceptance. And we went a little bit deeper, primarily with how the right to accept can be terminated. There may be a time frame on how long you have to accept an offer. Somebody may die or become mentally incapacitated. It could be terminated by a direct revocation. The offeror could call up, could send an email, offer's closed, I'm sorry. And that would end the power of acceptance. Then when we got to week 4, we began to look at situations where a purported acceptance would come in. It would be a little bit different from what the terms of the offer were. And the question became whether we reject it, it's a rejection counteroffer, a brand new offer, because it's so different, or whether it's close enough so that we should say that the parties have reached an agreement, and with the smaller details on which they disagree or they don't agree, we'll find a way to patch those together but maintain the contractual relationship. That's what we did significantly, particularly with regard to the Battle of the Forms. Okay? This week, Class 5, we are going into the third, but the final one we need to cover, box or component for contract formation, and that is consideration. The idea behind consideration is that each party to a contract must want something from the other side. You give up your bicycle, and that would be your consideration, a thing, and I give you $500. I would give up cash, a thing. You would give up your automobile, a thing. I would promise to pay you for the next 5 years $300 a month for 5 years. My promise, which is binding and legally enforceable, would also constitute appropriate consideration. The key or the problem that leads to this primary question of whether or not there's consideration is where parties are trying to cheat the system somehow. Maybe it's a gift. I give you my mansion for $1. That's a gift. That's not a contract. And the good news is, for purposes of this class, we don't cover property law here. That's another class. I taught that for 9 years. If you want to ask me about that outside of class, I'll be happy to speak about it. Otherwise, let's stick in the contracts world, which is where I prefer at this point. Okay? So, not a gift, but a contract. But people try to hide it that way. Tax evasion. I sell you this, and here's the money I get back, but it's really a way to hide taxation where gift tax might be higher than business tax, for example. Or there may be no tax on a business transaction, but there would be on a gift. And people try to hide that. And the system tries to find that out, identify it, and make things go under the proper rules. It could be a bribe. I sell you my new Mercedes for $15. Okay, there's something wrong. Could be a gift, could be a bribe, could be something wrong. And if it's not something that the other party really wants, then it's not consideration, and the contractual relationship should not be formed. There's a Latin term that you might want to use. It's very popular with regard to consideration, and it is the concept. It's quid pro quo. If you can see the Latin here, QUID, PRO QUO. And what it means in Latin basically is, roughly translated, the something for something else. It's what I give for what you're giving me. Each side comes to, bargains for, and exchanges something that has some kind of value. If one side doesn't have value, then it's a gift situation probably. Okay? It has to be bargained for or desired. And we have a test. There's a legal appropriateness of consideration, and it's how we check whether or not there is appropriate consideration. And courts begin with the question of sufficiency. There is a restatement section, I believe it's section 71 of the restatement second on contracts, that lists the type of things that represent appropriate, sufficient consideration. It could be a thing. It could be a tennis ball. It could be a computer. It could be a promise. I promise to pay you cash for the next 5 years. I promise to paint your garage. That promise as well, if it's legally enforceable, is in fact proper consideration. It could be forbearance. You hit me in the back of my car. I think that I could sue you for it, but if you give me $5,000 now, I promise I will not sue you. I will give up my legal right to sue you for $5,000. Both of those sides are backed by legally sufficient consideration. And courts typically take a look to see if the thing is an item, a promise, a forbearance, a thing that would represent an appropriate subject of desire for one side to ask in return for another. Okay? And problem arises when you see a significant disparity in values, or you see a situation that looks like corruption, bribery, a gift, and at those points, courts would go to the second question, beyond legal sufficiency, and go into adequacy. Okay? Keep in mind, courts prefer not to do that if they do not have to. Okay? They don't look into the subjective intent of people if they can find legal sufficiency. But if it's absurdly disparate values being exchanged, then courts will look into the adequacy question, and they check and they balance on whether or not there's a rough justification for the trade-off. And perhaps an example would be the easiest way to demonstrate the concept of adequacy. Let's go with legal sufficiency first. I'm on the tennis court, and I don't have any tennis balls. And so I look over to you and I say, I see you're playing. I'll buy a tennis ball for $2. A tennis ball is a thing, and that's legally sufficient. And the cash for $2 is also legally sufficient. So in that case, under those facts, there's legal sufficiency on both sides, end of story. What if you were my relative and I had some tennis balls with me and my tennis racket, and I see that you have some tennis balls, and I offered you $500,000 for one of your tennis balls? Okay? You, my nephew. It's not Venus Williams. Maybe one of her tennis balls signed is worth $500,000. Yours is not. Okay? So you see, is a tennis ball, could it be legally sufficient? Yes, for $2, but not for $500,000. So the courts would take a look and say, well, let's look at the adequacy now. Sufficient, it could be, but now there's a real problem with the disparate values. Is it really a gift? Is it a bribe? Is it something else? And then if it is, we should not be using contracts law to justify this exchange. Okay? Another example would be if you're standing next to a vending machine and I walk up and I offer you $2 for a bottle of soda in your hand. Here's $2. Or no, if I offer you $2, but I could put $2 in the machine myself. What if I offered you $10,000 for that soda? And yet I could just turn around to the machine and use even my credit card or my debit card and pull out a soda. Why in the world would I not use the machine, but I'd ask for yours for $10,000? Something is probably wrong there. Now let's change the facts to make it legally sufficient, even though there's a question of adequacy or a potential question of adequacy. Same thing, same amount, but we're in the desert, and I'm 5 miles from the next convenience store, and I've been in the desert 3 days without water, and my kidneys are about to shut down, and I see you with a nice cold Pepsi, and I either have $10,000 in my wallet, or I promise to pay you $10,000 from my bank account when I get back to civilization. Might I really want that Pepsi, the only liquid within at least 5 miles radius? And I'm in the process of kidney shutdown. might I offer you $10,000 to potentially save my life, as well as quench my thirst? The answer to that is absolutely. So you see the change of facts. You might still ask the adequacy question, and the adequacy question might still come out okay based on the facts and circumstances. Okay, so we've talked about the offer. We've talked about the acceptance. Today we focus on consideration and the primary questions of legal sufficiency. And if we have to, because the facts so indicate, for example, huge disparity in values, we might have to ask the adequacy question. But make sure you ask as a matter of first course sufficiency. And if you find something legally sufficient, stop just as the courts will. Hint on the exam. If you find two things that are legally sufficient, you might say, well, a promise to pay is sufficient, the bicycle is sufficient, and therefore it's legally sufficient consideration. Both sides are in the game. There's a quid pro quo on both sides, so consideration there is not a problem. You might also want to state, possibly parenthetically, if there had been a huge disparity in value, for example, courts might go to the secondary question of adequacy, but that's not involved under the facts at hand. You see that extra information shows me that you know in further detail what the test and how the system works, including a hierarchical understanding of the first line question and the second line question. That makes for a better answer if you have a chance to write that in an essay answer. Okay? Now we're going to be in consideration this third box, which is the last one we are dealing with now, information, for 2 or 3 more weeks. And so we talk about what consideration is and isn't generally this week with regard to the nature of the thing. But we're going to talk about certain categories that often do not rise to the level of proper consideration, or sometimes based on historical changes, they do. Remember we talked about offer and its 3 elements, but then gave 4 or 5 examples of things that are usually not offers, like social contracts, often like advertisements, as an example. Well, we've talked about consideration, and now in the weeks that follow Class 5, we'll talk about a few things that typically are not consideration, so that you understand some context and some examples. One is an illusory promise. If I promise to pay you $500 for your bicycle, if I want to, you see how I've kept the discretion in my hands to pay or not pay? That would be illusory, I-L-L-U-S-O-R-Y. And since I don't really bind myself to anything, that would not be consideration. And therefore, the consideration element would fail in a bargain that we may have had, and we would not have a formed contract. Okay? A promise to pay a past debt. What if you had a debt, the law cut it off, for example, under bankruptcy law, or a statute of limitations, which we cover in week 13, by the way, stops your duty to have to pay. If you re-promise, you've already been forgiven. In that situation, courts tend to enforce a renewal of a promise to pay a past debt up to the amount that you've promised. But you can see that you no longer legally owe it. Moral of the story, don't re-promise it if you don't want to pay it. Because legally, your liability or responsibility to pay has been discharged. Okay? Special rule with regard to consideration. Did the other side give you any consideration back? Right? You promised to repay a debt that's discharged. What did they give you in advance? They should say, here's an extra Pepsi for your promise to repay me. Pre-existing duty. If you have a duty to work for me for $1,000 a month, and then you come back to me and you say, I want $1,500 a month, or I'm going to stop, I could say, I can agree, go ahead. And when you sue me for $1,500, I can give you $1,000. You had a pre-existing duty to work for $1,000, and you didn't give me any new consideration for the extra $500 per month. You could say, you know what, I'll work 1 extra hour per day for that extra $1,500. That extra $500, I'll pay for it by working an extra hour a day. That would be proper consideration in support of the new promise. Finally, in the following week, we will cover consideration substitutes. There are examples where you can say there's no real consideration, but the law will imply or fill that gap for some reason based on equity, and we'll talk about promissory estoppel.